Despite his memorable name, Arpad Schmidhammer is far from well remembered either in or outside Germany. He was born in 1857 in the region of Bohemia, which at that time was part of the German Empire. There's very little record of his early life or education, but it is known his father was an artist, so it seems likely his early studies would have been with Schmidhammer Senior, before moving on to more formal study in both Vienna and Munich. The earliest evidence I found of his humorous illustration was in the magazine Fliegende Blätter in 1890, when he would have been 33 years old, so it's highly likely there would have been earlier work created. He also began working for Jugend magazine not long after it was first published in 1896. And although some of the images he produced for this magazine were comic in nature, he also created a large volume of remarkably diverse, more serious-minded images of immense dramatic power. And he was able to express himself across a wide range of outcomes and styles. In addition to interior page illustrations, he also created several particularly compelling covers at this time. He was simultaneously working as a book illustrator, and in 1897 Otto Roquette's story Waldmeister's Bridal Journey was published with a series of figurative monochrome watercolours by Schmidhammer. By the end of the century, his association with Fliegende Blätter seems to have come to an end, but he continued to be a significant contributor to Jugend for a few more years at least. Crucially, in 1904, Schmidhammer's own book about the adventures of the young boy Muki was published, and this series of absurdist playful illustrations featuring heavy black line and flat colour was a considerable popular success. The book's bold graphic styling and imaginative layouts were considerably ahead of the vast majority of children's books at this time. In the same year he illustrated The Grimm's Tale Red Riding Hood, but this book featured more traditional images with considerably more elaborate line work and shaded colour. 2 years later, in 1906, his version of the story of Pinocchio, known in Germany as Zepfelkern, was published, featuring a series of entertaining monochrome pen and ink images which were actually quite faithful to Collodi's original text. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the lack of evidence suggests he drastically reduced his commitment to Jugend and concentrated more on book work of his own and for other writers. He was already 57 and too old to fight when the Great War began in 1914, but as well as creating the occasional vitriolic cartoon for Jugend, he did his bit for the war effort by creating a series of propagandist war picture books for German children, bizarre as that now seems to contemporary sensibilities. The first was Dear Fatherland, Be Quiet, which didn't waste any time in whipping German children into a patriotic fervour. And he followed this with 1916's Hansen Pierre, subtitled A Funny Trench Story. This book pitted a German boy against his French counterpart, and of course Fritz emerged the victor. Another picture book, Maledetto Katzelmacher, was also published in 1916, and although this comedic fantasy's connection with the war wasn't as overt, it was nevertheless still present. Following the end of the war and Germany's defeat, it seems Schmidhammer created no more published work, and he died in 1921 at the age of 64. Howard Vetchell Brown was born in 1878 near Lexington, Kentucky, and between 1899 and 1902 he studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. In that year he also married, and in 1906 he and his wife moved to New York City, where he started to work as a freelance illustrator. He also took classes at the Art Students League, and in 1910 he was hired to teach at the Fawcett School of Industrial Arts. Unfortunately, the earliest example of his work I managed to find is this 1916 cover for the Scientific American. And over the coming years he created several more for this magazine, whilst also producing similar work for another scientific publication, Everyday Engineering, all of which were printed as tonal duotones. By 1920 he'd added radio news to his client list, and once more he did his best to make the most of relatively esoteric subject matter. But as the decade wore on, he also began working for Science and Invention magazine, And for this publication he took the opportunity to create work in full colour and provide considerably more imaginative imagery. Although his relationship with technology endured, in 1928 he also began creating more widely accessible populist material for Aage magazine and other pulps, including Amazing Detective. But there was no doubt that it was with the increasingly popular genre of science and speculative fiction that his future would best be served. He created a relatively small number of interior page monochromes, but it was his painted cover work that he began producing for Astounding Stories in the early 1930s which really made his reputation. Only a few years later he also began creating similar illustrations for others such as Thrilling Wonder and Startling Stories. All of these magazines combined to keep him comfortably in regular demand into the 1940s, and Howard V. Brown died in New Jersey at the age of 67 in 1945. I've been completely unable to find even one solitary piece of biographical information about the French illustrator Henri Fournier. There is plenty on French Wikipedia about his namesake, who apparently was a racing car driver, but that's not much help to me or you. I can't even tell you where or when he was born or died, so even more than usual it's going to be about the work he created. Luckily there's no shortage of that. The available evidence suggests that he first became active professionally around 1910, with quite a few examples of his fashion work dating from that time, before moving on to more amusing or narrative-based work. And soon enough he began appearing in several of the Parisian humour and lifestyle magazines, creating light-hearted and occasionally mildly erotic work in both colour and black and white. His pen work was both light and expressive, and although not averse to the occasional foray into hatching, for the most part he had little need of it. In colour he used watercolour washes which were moderately tonal in application but not slavishly so, and the results were particularly whimsical and visually pleasing. When the war with Germany began in 1914, naturally enough the subject became a dominant aspect of his work until the conflict had ended. And although he created many images portraying the bravery of the fighting men and the miseries and dangers they endured, while others were set on the justified vilification of the Kaiser and his troops, Fournier concentrated on creating a lighter morale-boosting humour from these admittedly tragic circumstances. When the war ended and the 1920s unfolded, Paris entered what were known as the Crazy Years, a European equivalent of America's Jazz Age, but with an abundance of legal alcohol consumption. And this hedonistic environment suited Fournier's light comic and sexually suggestive effervescence down to the ground. The bulk of his post-war work was created for La Vie Parisienne, a highly popular magazine which featured the erotic and humorous in equal measure, and which conspicuously refused to get on board with full-colour printing. Consequently, all Fournier's work for them was printed using the far cheaper duotone method instead. But artists of his ability weren't at all fazed by this limitation, and actually embraced it for its potential to create distinctive coloured images. Because many of these illustrations are undated, I've had to take a guess at how they might relate to each other sequentially, but I have enough dated evidence to know that in the 1930s the volume of his work declined sharply, with only a handful of examples in evidence. Why this would have been I have no idea, but the last image I found was published in 1942. And all I can tell you with any certainty is that sometime later Henri Fournier died at an unknown age in an unknown year. His legacy undoubtedly deserves better. Despite his successful career as an illustrator and lithographic artist, Aage Sikker Hansen is far from well documented either, although he fares somewhat better than Henri Fournier. And my apologies in advance to any Danish viewers for my pronunciation here. He was born in 1897 in Grenaa, the son of an engineering designer, and as a young man he attended the Aalborg Art Academy, if only briefly. Sometime around 1918 he took a job as a scenic painter at the Odense Theatre for a while, but wasn't particularly taken with the work. And he then studied lithography for 3 years at an unknown location, which would shape the nature of his future career considerably. There follows a bafflingly long period that's devoid of both biographical material or visual evidence until 1930, when he won a competition organised by the magazine Politiken to design a road safety poster. In the same year, he collaborated on the book Zoologisch Have with a collection of monochrome wildlife studies to accompany the relevant factual text, all of which were created as traditional stone lithographs. In 1932, he held his first exhibition of limited edition prints, which proved very successful in art circles, and in the same year he started work as a staff artist at the newspaper Politiken's Magasinet supplement. But other than his prints, there isn't any other evidence of his work from this period, and it seems that he didn't fully commit to commercial illustration until the mid-1930s, at which point he would have been approaching 40 years old. From this point onward, however, he designed a large number of remarkably inventive and attractive posters, mostly in colour, for a wide range of purposes and clients. The unifying factor in this body of powerful graphic images, other than their undoubted aesthetic accomplishment, was that they were all created using traditional lithography drawn onto the stones, using repeated colour runs. Allied with his stylised figure work, this gave these posters a distinctive, agreeably textured appeal. In 1939 he published another animal-themed book for children, but this time it was a work of fiction about a squirrel, and like his posters it was printed in colour. These illustrations were remarkably expressionistic and atmospheric in terms of their stylistic approach, and the book proved popular in Denmark at least. Denmark was supposedly neutral during the Second World War, but it was actually occupied by German forces for most of it. But there was nothing in Hansen's image to upset the country's overseers, and he was allowed to continue working for the duration. And when the war was over, he carried on as before, with equal success as an artist and illustrator, with yet more limited editions and bright upbeat poster work. Sometime around the end of the war, although I can't locate an actual date, he published an animal-themed calendar with a dozen remarkably expressive, quite minimalist monochrome lithographs, all of which were remarkably well composed. And although he continued to produce prints with a range of subjects, including some evocative landscapes, by now the great majority of his art was devoted to the evocation of wildlife, and increasingly it was for these images that he became best known. But in his poster work he remained diverse in his subject matter and continued to produce arresting images for all manner of purposes. Among them this A.M. Cassandra-influenced ship image, among many other equally striking and effective designs, which were ubiquitous throughout Denmark in the 1940s and 50s. Sikker Hansen was by this time at the height of his popularity, but what should have been a much longer creative career was unfortunately cut short when he died in Copenhagen in 1955 at the age of only 58. So that's the end of this 4, and 4 more will soon be on their way. See you then, I hope.